large amounts, with a few overdoses spotted, of consumption of Hopium and Copium of both sides of the fence, with this announcement coming from Blizzard yesterday around the balance tuning that will happen from now to the release of the expansion very soon, and then the release of the actual season. So this is what Blizzard had to say related to what we can expect in terms of changes to specs and to classes in the following weeks. The message itself starts with some fluff, pointing out that with the release of Midnight, players will get access over the levels with the new Apex talents and the few other talent points they will get for their General 3 and their Hero Talent 3, and that similar to the War Within changes, Blizzard will continue to look at class performance and any emergent pain points to see where we might have opportunities to make changes during, though keyword, during major content updates. The point is that in Midnight, since many specializations have undergone large changes in order to meet their design goals for the expansion, meaning mostly just pruning and a whole lot of removal of a bunch of different spells, as they will continue to monitor how the specs will be performing at the release of the expansion, the next planned pass is expected to arrive with the Midnight Season 1 launch on March 17th. That's when they will start analyzing the performance of the specs, because then the next pass will follow immediately afterwards, utilizing the data gathered from the opening of the pre-season on March the 17th, with the changes going live with the launch of Mythic Raid difficulty and Mythic Plus on March the 24th. So this is what we have as far as the announcement goes, this thing right here. That's our timeline. We have already gotten past the first handful of points in here, the checkpoints, starting with the end of the War Within Season 3 and then the beginning of the pre-patch event, and now we are very close, a few days away from the early access of Midnight. So from then to the 17th of March, we are basically 3 weeks away, basically 3 resets away from the 17th of March. So what becomes interesting from the statement of Blizzard is that that's when they will start with the tuning pass. So they will let the release of the expansion go without changes, the first 3 resets of basically nothing really being available for any proper testing. Like, you know, you have heroic dungeons, you're leveling up, maybe you're doing some delves, right? And then the 17th of March you have the normal raid opening, the heroic raid opening. We haven't gotten actually official confirmation, but according to usual timelines, Mythic 0 of the new dungeons will be open from not early access but from the full release of the expansion the 2nd of March for 2 resets, and then on the 17th of March the Mythic 0 of the Mythic Plus pool of dungeons will open, because as you know, only 4 of the new dungeons will be in the pool, with the 4 older dungeons being added to the Mythic Plus pool, so they will have their own Mythic 0 version once the pre-season opens. So that's when Blizzard will go and start giving their first tuning pass based on what's happening in that week. So normal raid, heroic raid, more Mythic 0 dungeons, without still, of course, Mythic Plus being open. And then as the beginning of the next week, when the actual season starts, is when they will land, essentially, as they say then, the last of the tuning before progression is over. That's what Blizzard also points out here, that even with these passes they will give to the specs, so one on the 17th of March and then one on the 24th, they will still be erring on the side of caution with the amount of tuning they will do until their respective mythic end bosses die, to avoid being overly disruptive to progression. That's when we have the point on the possibly serious use and abuse of Copium and Hopium, because you have different players on different sides of the spectrum reading these changes. You have the side, obviously, of players already planning on playing certain specs that they have been able to tell from now how well they were doing, right? Don't trust players who tell you that tier lists and rankings and power levels of specs right now don't matter. They definitely do. You know, players do know that Unholy Death Knight is drastically better than Enhancement Shaman, or that Arcane Mage is far superior to something like Shadow Priest. That is a common knowledge fact. So those players will be in Hopium mode. You're like, okay, we know we are already strong, we know we are some of the candidates for being meta picks, and now Blizzard told us we don't have to worry about anything, at least for 3 more weeks. We know for sure we're not gonna get touched for a while. So all of the good specs right now, you know, Brewmaster, Guardian Druid, Preservation Evoker, Resto Druid, Unholy Decay, Arcane Mage, Augmentation, Demonology, all of those specs will be in Hopium mode, hoping not to be touched inappropriately, creepily by Blizzard before the season begins. And then you have the other side, obviously, the side of these specs who know they're not doing too well, who know they are the ones who need help to get more relevant, to get more power before the season begins, who will be the one hoping that they will be noticed by Blizzard in these 2 tuning passes coming the 17th and the 24th of March to make them more relevant, to make them more viable, etc., right? Now, obviously, that's where hoping becomes a bit more likely than coping about it, because as Blizzard says, they will be erring on the side of caution with the amount of tuning they will do. So even when the tuning comes, you have to take into account it is still tuning that will happen as this season launches. So it's not tuning happening 1 or 2 months into the beta or before the release of the expansion, is literally days before the opening of the season. So essentially, there is not going to be any talent changes, any talent rework, repositioning of talents in your trees, changes of the way your hero talent works, etc. The best you will get at this point in time, with the tuning coming so late, will be small tuning of little tiny knobs. 5% buff, 3% nerf, 4% all damage buff, 5% damage to a certain ability. That is what is more likely to happen with this level of tuning. So this puts further, fewer chances for essentially the worse your spec was, the least likely it's gonna be receiving any relevant enough changes to become powerful. For example, right now, a spec like Sub-Rogue, or a spec like Red Paladin, or a spec like Fury Warrior, they're not meta. They're not even in the top third of the performing specs. They're not in the circle of specs expected to make it, for example, in a Mythic Plus comp, let's just point it out. But with one of those buffs, like a 7% damage buff, maybe a 10% focused buff on single target only, those kind of buffs is what could make them strong enough to become a contender for a Mythic Plus spot, perhaps, a main pick when it comes to your raid comp. Meanwhile, you have other specs, like, for example, Beast Mastery Hunter, specs like Affliction Warlock, spec like Feral Druid, Enhancement. Those are the ones that have been left further behind in terms of numbers, not necessarily in terms of how they play, in terms of how they've been designed. Many, for example, Enhancement players are happy with the way Enhancement plays. Affliction Warlocks have celebrated losing Malefic Rapture to go back to Unstable Affliction, etc., but their damage is still lower than other specs. So those are specs that would need larger numbers to become more relevant. Even if you're talking tanks, for example, Blood Decay is another tank that would need larger numbers, especially in terms of tankiness, less so about damage, even after being buffed in damage, and more tankiness to become more relevant. So the chances that the balance tuning that Blizzard pointed out will be more on the side of caution with these 2 tuning passes for these specs will be harder, will be less likely. Now, similarly is when it comes to nerfs, right? If you are already very powerful right now, the chances that Blizzard will scythe you down like wheat are less likely. Likely because, of course, you're already the most popular one. You have been broadcasted to the world by multiple players as one of the main specs. For example, let's just say Resto Druid. Players have pointed out Resto Druid being the pick for Mythic Plus, right? Or maybe Brewmaster for a tank, or perhaps Demo as a DPS. So this is already known. Players are already aware of this. Top high-level Mythic Plus players are already thinking about their comps to play. Many of these specs will be part of it, if not most. So the chances that Blizzard will just cut you down enormously right as this season launches with a 15% damage nerf is less likely. We can also say this because we do have decent history behind this, even if we go all the way back to Shadowlands and talk about release power level. Very often you have been able to get with decent accuracy an idea of which specs were going to be the to-go specs before a season start, and it has happened rarely that Blizzard has cut down out of nowhere one of the expected powerful specs right before release. A few specs have been unlucky, sure. For example, Unholy Decay before the release of Shadowlands was prepped to be one of the main strongest specs before Blizzard, right as the expansion release, nerfed after the first week, nerfed their mastery by like 20% and took them out of contention of being, for example, one of the main Mythic Plus specs. But you already knew. We already knew about Maximus Ship Hunter, we already knew about Fire Mage, about Vengeance Demon Hunter going to be the meta tank. These things were known already from the beta, and they just went in the release of Shadowlands just as you expected from the beta. If you move over to Dragonflight, you have some certainties by looking at the performance in the beta already. Prot Warrior, Resto Druid, Outlaw, Havoc Demon Hunter were also, known specs, and no change was given to them. They went from meta in the beta to meta in live, just like that. We had something slightly different at the release of this expansion in the War Within, with a delayed change, because again in the beta you knew that Frost Decay was the spec to play. You also knew that Augmentation Evoker was going to continue, unfortunately, to be one of the main specs. The only question mark was tied to the fact that a couple of the other very strong specs were Shaman's DPS, while also the strongest healer was Resto Shaman. So you had this question mark of who was going to make it out, since it was very unlikely you were going to play two specs of the same class in your Mythic Plus comp, for example, if it was going to be Resto Shaman or if it was going to be one of the DPS specs. Ultimately, you started out with Resto Shaman for about a month before it was nerfed, so they fell out of the meta. But for the most part, besides a couple of sacrifices, immolating themselves in front of Blizzard to shield everyone else, you have been able to predict who was doing well in the beta into who was going to do well in live, without really seeing too often this idea that being powerful in the beta doesn't really matter because then Blizzard could nerf you last minute before the season releases. It's not actually true. It has happened very rarely in our betas before the release of a new expansion. So basically, with this announcement from Blizzard, we could at best be thinking at who would be the Sacrificial Lamb to be thrown in the maw of Blizzard to shield the rest? Could they get out of nowhere demo, perhaps Unholy, maybe Augmentation again, maybe Arcane Mage, one of them to take the fall down to F tier for the rest of them so they can continue to be meta as predicted? That's perhaps the worst that could happen. It is though more likely, even with the confirmation in this announcement, putting it in virtual black and white on paper, the fact that they aren't even planning on doing some major changes anyways. So the +5, -5, +7, -4% kind of changes, kind of tuning, is less likely to impact the very strong specs, who will likely remain strong already, and the very weak specs, who will likely remain weak already. It might help more swing things around in the middle of the pack. Some more undecided specs sort of being there, perhaps undervalued, underrated, maybe getting hit by a 6% damage buff could bring them to be more seen now. That's the best that could happen, more likely. However, though, with this announcement out, the point remains: no worries about waking up one day realizing the spec you were planning to play has just gotten kneecapped. At least now you have a date to look forward to, the 17th of March for the first pass, and then the 24th of March for the second pass of the tuning before the actual season launches. After that, even because of the way the raids are being released, staggered, it's going to take you at least 3 more weeks before any more balanced tuning will come. So that's what we have for today in terms of the timeline for any more balanced tuning coming at the release of this first season. So name of the day and the name of the next 3 weeks, I guess, will be to just wait and see for the tuning. So for today, on this Tuesday, this is what we have for now. We're going to start our goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who's been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, meat. Today we have decided we're gonna go through some meat period. We need the energy with the expansion so close to be coming out.